Most people will tell you India and Pakistan were born because two peoples, Hindus and Muslims, simply couldn't live together anymore after centuries of religious tension. Some will tell you it was inevitable the moment the British announced they were leaving, that ancient hatreds, held in check for generations only by colonial force, finally boiled over the instant that force was withdrawn. Others will point to the personal ambitions of a handful of political leaders, or to the sheer scale of a subcontinent too vast and too diverse to ever function as one nation. And sure, all of that played some part. But here's what the textbooks consistently get wrong. The border that tore the subcontinent in half wasn't drawn by history, or by religion, or by the accumulated will of the 400 million people who had to live with it. It was drawn in 5 weeks, by a man who had never set foot in India before, working off maps that were already out of date, under a deadline that existed for reasons that had almost nothing to do with India at all. The line that decided which side of a village, a farm, a temple, or a family's ancestral home would become Pakistan and which would remain India was, in the most literal and uncomfortable sense, drawn by a stranger under pressure to finish on time. Let me take you through this story, not the way it usually gets told, as an inevitable clash of civilizations, but the way the archival record actually shows it happening, as a series of administrative decisions made under time pressure that had nothing to do with the people on the ground by men who would not have to live with the consequences of what they signed. Let me say it plainly before we go any further, because it matters. Partition wasn't the tragic, inevitable outcome of two civilizations that could no longer coexist. It was the direct, foreseeable, and in many respects predicted result of one imperial decision to leave faster than almost anyone on the ground thought was safe, and to let the actual map drawing happen almost as an afterthought to that decision, compressed into a fraction of the time that experienced colonial administrators believed the job required. Somewhere between 1 and 2 million people died in the months that followed. Between 14 and 18 million were displaced, in what remains, to this day, the largest mass migration in recorded human history outside of war itself. In the single most consequential border in modern history, a line that still divides two nuclear-armed nations, was finished so late and communicated so poorly that most of the people forced to cross it didn't know where it actually ran until they were already fleeing across it in one direction or the other. To understand how this happened, you first have to understand what British rule in India actually was by the 1940s. Not a single, unified colony administered from one office in Delhi, but a deliberately fractured patchwork empire built on division as a governing principle. Roughly 2/3 of the subcontinent was administered directly as British India under the Crown. The remaining third was a mosaic of more than 500 princely states, each technically sovereign under its own Maharaja or Nawab, each bound to the British Crown by a separate treaty of paramountcy, and each, crucially, free to choose its own path, accede to India, accede to Pakistan, or in a handful of cases attempt to remain independent altogether, the moment British authority formally withdrew. For nearly 2 centuries, London had governed this vast and staggeringly diverse population, not by unifying it culturally or administratively, but by governing it through separate personal law codes for Hindus and Muslims, separate systems of land revenue in different regions, and a colonial bureaucracy that increasingly treated religious community, rather than region, language, or caste, as the single, most useful and legible category for sorting an empire's subjects. This wasn't accidental. A population divided along clear, countable lines was, from the narrow standpoint of imperial administration, a manageable one, easier to survey, easier to tax, easier to co-opt piece by piece into loyalty to the crown rather than uniting against it. The Morley-Minto reforms of 1909 and the Government of India Act of 1919 had gone even further, formally creating separate electorates in which Muslim voters in many provinces elected only Muslim representatives and Hindu voters elected only Hindu representatives, encoding religious identity directly into the machinery of Indian political representation for the first time in the subcontinent's history, rather than leaving it as one dimension among many in a shared civic life. What had been, in countless towns and villages across the subcontinent, a matter of shared marketplaces, shared festivals, shared languages, and centuries of intermarried, interwoven daily existence was gradually reframed, decade by decade, election by election, into 2 competing political blocs with 2 increasingly incompatible sets of demands. By the 1930s and 40s, that administrative habit had hardened into hard political reality. The Indian National Congress, led by figures like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, positioned itself publicly as a secular, pan-Indian movement fighting for a single united and independent nation, one in which religious identity would be a private matter rather than a political category. The All India Muslim League, led by the formidable lawyer and politician Muhammad Ali Jinnah, increasingly argued, with growing conviction after the 1937 provincial elections, in which Congress swept to power in several provinces and, in the League's view, governed with little regard for Muslim political concerns, that India's Muslims, roughly a quarter of the subcontinent's population but a majority, in specific regions like Punjab and Bengal, needed a fully separate homeland to avoid becoming a permanent, powerless minority inside a Hindu-majority state. In March of 1940, the Muslim League formally adopted what became known as the Lahore Resolution, calling for independent states in the Muslim-majority regions of the subcontinent, the first formal, public articulation of what would eventually become Pakistan. Both political visions, secular unity, and religious partition had genuine and growing popular support by the mid-1940s. But the administrative machinery that would eventually have to decide between them, the maps, the district-level census data, the electoral rolls, the boundary conventions, had been built over 2 centuries by an empire whose entire operating logic depended on treating religious community as the primary, legible lens through which to govern. And by 1945, with Congress and the League locked in an increasingly bitter and irreconcilable standoff over what independence should even look like, that inherited machinery was still the only tool available for deciding, if it ever came to that, where any future border between them might actually fall. It's worth pausing here on just how deep this administrative logic ran, because it shapes everything that follows. The 1941 census, the last full colonial census conducted before independence, recorded population data down to the level of individual villages and city wards, broken out explicitly by religious community, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Christian, and so on. This was the single most detailed demographic snapshot available to anyone tasked with drawing a future boundary, and it was, by its very design, a document built to answer exactly one kind of question: where, geographically, did which religious community hold a numerical majority? It was not designed to capture economic interdependence, shared irrigation systems, extended family networks that crossed what would become the new border, or the countless practical, everyday ways in which Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh communities in Punjab in particular were woven into a single functioning regional economy. When the moment finally came to draw a border, the only tool sharp enough to do it quickly was a tool built exclusively to count people by religion, not to understand how those people actually lived together. By 1945, Britain was, in every meaningful financial and military sense, finished as a global imperial power, even if the formal paperwork hadn't caught up yet. The Second World War had left the country with a national debt exceeding 250% of GDP, and the cost of continuing to maintain hundreds of thousands of British and Indian troops, thousands of civil administrators, and the entire apparatus of colonial government across the Indian subcontinent was no longer a burden that London could plausibly justify to its own exhausted, rationed, war-weary taxpayers. Prime Minister Clement Attlee, presiding over a newly elected Labour government that had campaigned on a mandate of domestic reconstruction, housing, healthcare, the beginnings of the welfare state, rather than continued imperial administration, had little appetite and even less fiscal room to prolong British rule in India any further than was strictly, unavoidably necessary. The original plan, formally announced by the Attlee government in February of 1947, called for a British withdrawal from India by June of 1948, more than a full year out from that announcement, and in theory, enough time for an orderly, carefully sequenced transfer of power, with independent boundary commissions given adequate time to survey population data district by district, town by town, before any final line was drawn. Viceroy, Lord Wavell, who had held the post since 1943, had spent considerable effort trying to manage a workable transition on something close to that longer timetable, understanding from years of direct experience just how combustible the situation on the ground already was. Then, in February of 1947, the same month the withdrawal announcement was made, Britain replaced Wavell with Lord Louis Mountbatten as the new and, as it would turn out, final Viceroy of India, and the entire timeline accelerated dramatically. Mountbatten, a decorated naval officer and cousin of the king, arrived in Delhi in March of 1947 carrying explicit instructions to achieve a transfer of power by June of 1948, if at all possible, but with considerable personal discretion over how to get there. He took one look at the deteriorating security situation on the ground. Communal riots had already broken out with terrible ferocity in Calcutta the previous August, in what came to be known as the Great Calcutta Killing, leaving an estimated 4,000 people dead in a matter of days, and further waves of violence were already spreading through the Punjab and Noakhali and Bengal, and made the single decision that would come to define the entire tragedy that followed. Rather than sticking to the original June 1948 timeline, Mountbatten unilaterally moved the date of independence forward by 10 full months, to mid-August of 1947. His stated reasoning, delivered forcefully to a stunned Indian leadership and to his own colonial administration, was that further delay would only allow the communal violence to metastasize further, that every additional month of political uncertainty was itself actively fueling the bloodshed already underway, and that a clean, decisive break was preferable to a long, agonizing, drawn-out one. His critics, then and in the decades since, have argued precisely the opposite, that the drastically compressed timeline made the eventual violence far worse rather than better, because it left almost no time to prepare the administrative machinery of two entirely new states, no time to plan or protect the movement of tens of millions of people who would ultimately need to relocate, and most critically of all, for the story we're telling here, barely any time whatsoever to actually draw, survey, and properly communicate the line that would separate the two new nations. Senior British civil servants on the ground, men with decades of direct administrative experience in Punjab and Bengal, reportedly warned Mountbatten directly and repeatedly that rushing the boundary award to such an extreme degree would be dangerous, that the region's religiously mixed demographics made anything short of a slow, carefully surveyed process almost certain to trigger exactly the kind of chaos everyone claimed to want to avoid. Mountbatten pressed ahead regardless, publicly announcing what became known as the 3rd of June Plan, independence by the 15th of August, barely 10 weeks away, to an Indian political leadership that had, until literally days earlier, been planning around a completely different and far more distant calendar. That line, the one that would decide the fate of tens of millions of people, ultimately fell to a man named Cyril Radcliffe. It's worth noting what almost happened instead. Earlier proposals, circulated within the India office in London as far back as 1946, had floated timelines allowing for a full year of dedicated boundary survey work, including ground-level consultation with local district officers who had spent decades administering the specific villages and towns in question, men who, unlike Radcliffe, actually knew which roads, which canals, and which extended family. Networks ran across the lines being considered on paper. Those proposals were shelved once Mountbatten's accelerated August deadline was locked in. There simply wasn't time left to do the job the way earlier planners had assumed it would be done. Radcliffe was a distinguished British barrister, a King's Counsel with an outstanding legal reputation in London, who had never in his life traveled east of Paris. He had no prior experience whatsoever in South Asia, no background in geography or cartography, no personal or professional stake in the outcome, and by his own later account, and Mountbatten's, that absence of any prior connection to the subcontinent was precisely the point. The British government wanted someone with no existing loyalties to any Indian community, no prior relationships with Congress or the League, someone whose complete unfamiliarity with the region could be presented, however implausibly, as a guarantee of impartiality. Radcliffe arrived in Delhi on the 8th of July, 1947, and was formally appointed to chair two separate boundary commissions, one tasked with dividing Punjab, one with dividing Bengal, each nominally including 2 representatives from Congress and 2 from the Muslim League, though in practice those 4-member panels deadlocked so completely and so predictably on nearly every substantive question that the actual final decisions rested almost entirely on Radcliffe alone, as the neutral chairman with the tie-breaking vote. He was given 5 weeks to complete both boundaries, working in the punishing heat of the Delhi summer with outdated 1941 census maps, incomplete and in places contradictory population data, and almost no opportunity to travel to or personally inspect the actual territory whose fate he was deciding from an office desk. Working under those conditions, Radcliffe had to divide 2 of the most religiously, linguistically, and economically intertwined provinces on the entire subcontinent, regions where Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh communities in Punjab, or Hindu and Muslim communities in Bengal, had lived side by side, often in the same villages and even the same extended families through generations of intermarriage, for centuries, into cleanly separated pieces that would become India and Pakistan. He met on several occasions with representatives from both Congress and the Muslim League, who pressed him repeatedly and with mounting anxiety for even preliminary details on where exactly the border might fall, particularly around contested cities like Lahore, Amritsar, and Calcutta, whose fate would determine the economic and symbolic character of the new border regions. According to multiple accounts from those present, Radcliffe remained deliberately evasive throughout, offering only the vaguest of indications, keenly aware that revealing specific details too early, before his own commissions had even finished their work, risked triggering violence and preemptive population movements before any line was actually finalized. When one aide reportedly asked him directly how he intended to draw a clean border through regions where villages of different faiths sat interwoven, sometimes literally street by street, for hundreds of continuous miles, Radcliffe is said to have replied only that there simply wasn't time to do the job any other way than quickly and imperfectly. He finished the boundary award for both Punjab and Bengal on the 12th of August, 1947, just 3 days before Indian and Pakistani independence was formally set to take effect at midnight on the 14th. Mountbatten, for reasons that remain debated among historians to this day, variously attributed to a desire not to overshadow the independence celebrations themselves, to logistical printing delays, or to a deliberate decision to avoid giving communities time to react violently before the transfer of power was legally complete, chose not to publish the actual boundary maps until the 17th of August, a full 3 days after both India and Pakistan had already become fully independent, sovereign nations. This meant that millions of people across Punjab and Bengal went to sleep on Independence Day itself, not knowing, in the most literal sense, which of the two brand new countries they were now living in. Families who had lived in the same villages for generations discovered which nation they now belonged to only after the maps were finally released to the public. In a great many documented cases, days after communal violence had already forced them to abandon their homes and begin fleeing in one direction or the other, guided as much by rumor and panic as by any actual knowledge of where the final line had been drawn. Radcliffe himself, by every contemporary and later account, was deeply shaken by what he had been asked to do and by what followed. He refused to accept his salary for the assignment. He deliberately burned nearly all of his working papers, notes, and draft maps before departing India for the last time, reportedly telling colleagues he did not want them used or scrutinized later. He never returned to the subcontinent again for the rest of his life, and he reportedly refused for decades afterward to discuss the details of his time in India in any public forum. Decades later, in one of his rare recorded reflections on the assignment, he told a biographer that he had come to believe the British government should never have compressed the boundary drawing process into such a punishing time frame, that the human cost of that speed had been genuinely catastrophic, and that he had understood, even as he was drawing the line under enormous pressure to finish on schedule, that the human toll would be immense. Here is the mechanism that most popular retellings of partition skip over entirely, treating the violence as simply an inevitable, almost natural eruption of long-suppressed religious hatred. The killing that followed wasn't primarily a direct effect of where the line was ultimately drawn. It was, in the judgment of most serious historians who have studied the sequence of events closely, a direct and largely foreseeable effect of when it was drawn, and how little institutional capacity existed to manage the transition it triggered. By compressing a process that experienced colonial administrators believed genuinely needed at least a year, and some internal assessments at the time put the realistic figure closer to 3 to 5 years for anything approaching an orderly, protected population transfer into 5 frantic weeks of desk work followed by a further 3 days of enforced secrecy before publication, Mountbatten's acceleration didn't simply produce an imperfect line. It created a vacuum of information and security precisely at the moment such a vacuum was most dangerous. Armed groups on both sides of the emerging, still unpublished border, fully aware that a hard line was coming within days, but not exactly where it would fall, began violently cleansing religiously mixed villages preemptively in the final weeks of July and first weeks of August, in a considerable number of documented cases, before Radcliffe had even finished drafting his final award, let alone before it had been made public. The British administrative and security apparatus across Punjab and Bengal, already stretched to breaking point and actively winding down its own personnel and operations in preparation for its own imminent, final withdrawal, was in no meaningful position to intervene at the scale required. The Punjab Boundary Force, the specific military unit hastily assembled and tasked with maintaining order across the affected region during the transition, numbered barely 50,000 troops responsible for policing an area that was, by that point, home to well over 10 million people already in active, panicked motion in both directions. It was, by nearly every later official and academic assessment, hopelessly and predictably undersized for the task it had been given, and it was formally disbanded within a matter of weeks as the scale of the violence completely overwhelmed its limited capacity. The killing, in other words, wasn't spontaneous religious hatred simply erupting all at once the moment colonial restraint was lifted. It was the largely predictable result of announcing a fixed deadline for tearing an intricately interwoven subcontinent in half without building any of the actual infrastructure needed to do so safely. No coordinated, protected evacuation corridors, no remotely adequate troop deployment along the emerging new border, no meaningful transition period during which the affected population could plan and relocate under any kind of protection at all. There's a further layer to this mechanism that rarely makes it into popular accounts. Because the final boundary award wasn't published until 3 days after independence, the two new governments of India and Pakistan technically came into legal existence on the 14th and 15th of August without either country actually knowing, in any officially confirmed sense, the full extent of the territory each one governed. Military units on both sides were left uncertain, in the most literal operational terms, which side of emerging flashpoints they were even meant to be defending. Local British district officers, many already packing to leave the country for good within days of independence, in a considerable number of documented cases simply had no instructions at all for how to respond to communal violence breaking out in areas whose national allegiance hadn't yet been formally announced. The result was a security vacuum layered on top of an information vacuum, at precisely the moment both mattered most. What followed in the weeks after independence was one of the largest, fastest mass migrations in all of human history, and one of the deadliest. Somewhere between 14 and 18 million people crossed the new India-Pakistan border in both directions within a matter of months, the overwhelming majority on foot, gathered into enormous refugee columns, some stretching, according to eyewitness and journalistic accounts of the time, for more than 40 continuous miles, that moved slowly across the newly divided Punjab countryside under brutal, late summer heat, harassed and frequently attacked along the way by armed groups from the opposing community. Trains, intended as the fastest and safest means of crossing the new frontier, instead became some of the most horrifying symbols of the entire catastrophe. Trains crossed the new border in both directions, packed with the murdered bodies of passengers killed en route, arriving at stations in Lahore or Amritsar with nothing left alive on board, blood visibly staining the platforms as they pulled in. Estimates of the total death toll range enormously, from several 100,000 at the most conservative end to as many as 2 million at the higher end of serious scholarly estimates, a range so wide precisely because no single authority, not the departing colonial government, and not the two brand new national governments scrambling simultaneously to organize themselves from nothing, had the administrative capacity to count the dead with any accuracy amid the chaos. Reports of mass abductions and sexual violence against tens of thousands of women on both sides of the new border, part of a systematic pattern of communal violence in which women's bodies became a specific and deliberate target, compounded the human tragedy still further, with much of it never formally documented, prosecuted, or resolved in the decades that followed, despite subsequent joint recovery. Efforts by both governments to locate and repatriate abducted women. Entire major cities changed their religious composition within a matter of weeks. Lahore, which had for centuries been home to a substantial and economically significant Hindu and Sikh population, and Amritsar, which had similarly been home to a significant Muslim population, were each transformed almost overnight into the religiously homogeneous cities they largely remain today. Punjab itself, one of the wealthiest and most agriculturally productive regions of the entire subcontinent, was cut directly and brutally in half, its intertwined Sikh, Hindu, and Muslim communities forcibly separated after generations of genuinely shared village life, shared irrigation systems, and shared local economies. Mountbatten, who had personally pushed hardest for the accelerated timeline against the advice of his own senior administrators, would later privately acknowledge, in terms considerably more measured than the scale of the catastrophe warranted, that he had significantly underestimated how violent the transition would ultimately become. Radcliffe's line, hastily drawn under extreme time pressure, imprecisely surveyed with outdated data, and announced days too late to matter for the millions already in flight, remains, more than 75 years later, one of the most contested, heavily fortified, and militarized borders anywhere on Earth. The economic toll compounded the human one in ways that took decades to fully unwind. Punjab's canal colonies, an irrigation system painstakingly engineered under British rule over the preceding half-century to turn semi-arid land into some of the most productive farmland on the subcontinent, were sliced apart by the new border with almost no consideration given to which side would control the headworks that fed which downstream canals. Farmers on one side of the new line frequently found themselves cut off from water sources they had relied on for generations, an engineering and administrative headache that took India and Pakistan more than a decade of subsequent negotiation, eventually formalized in the 1960 Indus Waters Treaty, to even partially resolve. The pattern on display here isn't unique to India, and it's worth pulling back to see just how consistently it repeats. Time and again, across the broader history of imperial withdrawal in the 20th century, when colonial powers pull out of territories they've administered along artificial or administratively convenient lines, the speed and manner of that departure ends up determining the ultimate scale of the aftermath far more decisively than the underlying ethnic or religious tensions themselves, however real those tensions may genuinely be. The same rushed, externally drawn borders that split Punjab and Bengal apart in the space of 5 weeks in the summer of 1947 echo in strikingly similar hurried partitions and boundary decisions made across the wider former colonial world, from the arbitrary straight-line borders imposed across the Middle East in the years following the First World War to the equally rushed and often unresolved boundary. Decisions made across large parts of colonial Africa as European powers withdrew in the 1950s and 60s. In nearly every one of these cases, the surviving historical record shows a remarkably consistent pattern. The specific location of the border is rarely, on its own, the true underlying source of the conflict that eventually follows. The conditions under which that border was drawn, how much time was allowed, how much local knowledge was actually consulted, how much protective infrastructure was put in place before the announcement rather than after, very often are. India and Pakistan have gone on to fight 4 separate wars since that summer of 1947, and the ongoing Kashmir dispute, which stems directly and traceably from decisions made in those same rushed weeks, remains today one of the single most dangerous, unresolved territorial flashpoints on the entire planet. 2 nuclear-armed states still actively contesting a boundary question that, in its original form, was never meant to be settled in 5 improvised weeks by a single outside lawyer working from an office desk in Delhi. Even the 2 countries formerly shared administrative and physical infrastructure, railway networks, telegraph systems, and, perhaps most consequentially, the interconnected canal and irrigation systems of Punjab, all of which had been engineered and built as single, unified systems under decades of British colonial administration, were abruptly sliced apart along those same rushed boundary lines, creating decades of subsequent infrastructure disputes and, especially, water-sharing conflicts over the rivers of the Indus Basin that persist in various negotiated and unresolved forms, right up to the present day. There's one real, hard lesson buried in how the British Empire's presence on the Indian subcontinent actually came to an end. It's this: the manner and the pace of an empire's departure can inflict as much lasting damage as the empire's presence ever did in the first place. A line drawn in haste, under external pressure that has nothing to do with the people it divides, doesn't simply disappear once the ink on the map has dried and the ceremony is over. It outlives the men who drew it in their air-conditioned offices, and it outlives, in the most painful and literal sense, the millions of people who died or were displaced trying to cross it in those first chaotic weeks. A line drawn in 5 weeks by a man who wanted, more than anything, simply to finish the job and go home is still, to this day, one of the most heavily militarized and unresolved borders anywhere on Earth. If this changed the way you think about how empires actually end, hit subscribe. There's a lot more of this story still to tell.